Unsealed Archives, Washington, 1972. The recording machine in the basement didn't know what it was recording. 3 reels turned at 1 7/8 inches per second, spooled through a machine that cost $3,000, voice-activated, patient, indifferent to what crossed its heads. June 23rd, 1972, 6 days after the arrests. The Oval Office smelled like carpet cleaner and tobacco and old walls. Nixon stood at the window, looking at the glass itself rather than through it. Reporters' cars lined the drive. He didn't look at them. "They're going to start pulling threads," he said. Haldeman was at the desk with his yellow legal pad. He didn't take notes. He transcribed facts in black, problems in blue. "The Watergate thing, Haldeman. The Watergate thing is the thread," Nixon said. "You pull it, other things come loose." He sat down. His hands were still. "This fellow Hunt, he knows too damn much. He was in that other thing years ago." "The Bay of Pigs," Haldeman said. "The whole Bay of Pigs thing." Under the Bay of Pigs was everything it led to, the operations, the names written in the margins of classified files, the men who had been told to do things, and then told to forget they had been told. The Bay of Pigs was the scab. Under it, something that would not close. Haldeman read from the pad. Mitchell had come up with it the day before. Dean had walked it through overnight. Walters at the CIA calls Gray at the FBI and tells him the Bureau is about to stumble into something that touches national security. "National security," Nixon said. "That's what we call it when we mean shut it down." "All right, fine." He looked at the window again. "When you talk to Walters, say it that way. Say it opens the whole Bay of Pigs thing again, person to person, man to man. They were there and they know what it means." He walked to the credenza and poured a glass of water. He didn't drink it. He held it, watching the light bend through it. "After you talk to Walters, we never talk about this again," he said. "Not here. Not on the telephone. Not in writing. This conversation doesn't exist." But it did exist. It was moving through the reels in the cabinet in the sub-basement. The magnetized particles aligning themselves in the exact pattern of his voice, saying the thing he was saying. He set the glass down. The water settled. He watched the drive and waited for the moment the men at the dinner parties would come for him. They always came. November 7th, 1962. The Beverly Hilton Ballroom. 8:45 in the morning. The reporters were already wearing the right faces when Nixon came out. They had been waiting 12 years for this. He had just lost the race for governor of California 2 years after losing the presidency by a hair. He talked for 16 minutes, careful and courteous, with the trained exactness of a man who had practiced courtesy under extreme conditions for so long it had become structural. And then he stopped being careful. "You won't have Nixon then to kick around anymore," he said. "Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." He walked out the service entrance. Pat was in the back seat of the car. She had been there 45 minutes listening to the radio and not going inside. She put her hand on his arm. The real hand, not the ceremony hand. She did not speak. She never asked what he was thinking. She never had to. 6 years in the wilderness. He moved to New York, practiced law and read history in the mornings, Toynbee and Gibbon and Churchill, with the appetite of a man who believes every pattern that ever mattered has already happened somewhere. He was the scholarship boy from Whittier. They were the Ivy men from Hyannisport. What they did not have was the ledger. Nixon kept the ledger in his head. Every snub, every foreign minister who called the private citizen because the scholarship boy saw further than the trust fund kids. Every man who said regrets in 1952 and would need something in 1967. When Goldwater went down in 1964, Nixon campaigned in 36 states for a man who could not win. He shook every county chairman's hand. He stayed in their motels. He came when the Harvard boys sent their regrets. The debt was not discussed. It did not need to be. July 1967. Bohemian Grove in the old-growth redwoods north of San Francisco. 2,000 of the country's most powerful men every summer since 1878. The camps had names, and the membership lists were the country's real directory. You came every year. You stood in the ceremony even when it looked foolish. The man who skipped the firelight when he was low did not get invited when he was high. Nixon had been to the Grove 8 times. He came in the Exile years because the Exile years were the ones that mattered. He found Reagan after the lakeside talk. In the Grove, the important conversations were always short. He wasn't asking for anything, he said, but he knew the counties. He knew the precincts. When the nominee stood on the convention floor next summer, he would need what Nixon had built. Reagan said nothing for a moment. I understand, he said. 3 minutes. The 1968 nomination required 3. He won it on the first ballot. October 31st, 1968, 5 days before the election. Lyndon Johnson announced a bombing halt in Vietnam. Peace talks were moving in Paris. The polls tightened. Anna Chennault was a Washington institution, the widow of the Flying Tigers general, tied to the South Vietnamese government through 15 years of relationships. She received a call from the Nixon campaign. The message she carried to the South Vietnamese embassy was 3 words wide. Hold on. Don't sign. The Republicans will give you better terms than Johnson is offering. Wait. President Thieu pulled out of the peace talks. Johnson's gambit collapsed. Johnson knew within 48 hours. The intercepts were on his desk. He sat in the Oval Office with the file and called Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader in the Senate. I'm going to say that the Republican nominee has been guilty of treason, Johnson said. Dirksen was quiet a moment. I know, he said. But Johnson could not go public. Going public meant admitting he had wiretapped the presidential nominee, the embassy, the campaign. He buried the file. He gave Nixon the presidency. That night, Nixon sat with the legal pad. He wrote a number and crossed it out. Then a larger one. The projection was not a number. It was names. The ones who would go and not come back. The mothers who would get the telegram. 4 more years of them. He did not write the names. He never wrote the names. The war ran 4 more years. He carried them. January 20th, 1969. He stood on the Capitol steps in the cold with his hand on the Bible and said the words. He had spent 20 years preparing, not just campaigning. He had learned the shape of the machine he was about to inherit. Which conversations never got written down? Which agencies answered to whom? Which operations continued regardless of who sat in the chair? Pat stood beside him in the red coat. She took his arm. 3 seconds. Not photographed. He didn't look at her. He turned and raised his hand to the crowd. The technicians came in. February 1971. 7 of them cleared at the highest level. They pressed microphones into the lamp bases of the Oval Office, ran wire through the walls, wired the telephones through a separate relay. The control unit sat in a basement closet, reel-to-reel machines, voice-activated, each reel holding 6 hours. Every man signed a document that did not say what he had installed, only that he could never speak of it. The machines went live on February 16, 1971. Nixon's logic, never given publicly, ran like this: the desk accumulates. Every decision he made in every room would one day be contested by the men who made it with him, and they would contest it in the direction of their own survival. He had watched it happen to other presidents. Kennedy had installed a system after the Bay of Pigs, when his own advisors backed the invasion in the planning and denied it in the aftermath. Nixon had been in rooms like that. The rooms where men said things they later did not say. He wanted evidence. He got 3,700 hours of himself. What the tapes caught was the man with his guard down. October 1973. The Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on the Holy Day, and within a week the Israeli ammunition was nearly gone. Golda Meir called the White House directly. The State Department wanted to move slow, afraid of an Arab oil embargo. The Pentagon wanted to move slow. Nixon listened, and then he ordered the largest emergency airlift in American history. 30,000 tons of arms, transports in the air for 30 days. It turned the war. Golda Meir told her cabinet that for generations they would tell of the miracle of the airlift. Deciding it on the tape, Nixon said something else. "The Jews will never forgive us if we let them lose," he said. "And they've got the power to make us pay. The press, the Congress, the money. If we let them lose, they'll destroy us everywhere." He saved them, and he said that in the same hour. Both are on the tape. The machine caught the rest of him too, on Black Americans, to his chief of staff. "I have the greatest affection for them, but I know they're not going to make it for 500 years. The same administration desegregated more Southern schools than any since Reconstruction. On Henry Kissinger, the advisor who served him and sat beside him in every room that mattered. God damn his Jewish soul. He said the ugliest things a president has ever been recorded saying, and some of the time he governed against his own worst mouth. The tape did not sort the two. It kept both. What he did not know was that he was not the only one recording. Down the hall, Kissinger ran his own system in his own office, capturing conversations Nixon did not know were being captured. Kissinger sat in the room and said nothing and thought about his memoirs. Nixon believed he was the only one holding the ledger. He was not. The system was exposed in July 1973 when a quiet aide named Alexander Butterfield told the Senate committee, almost in passing, that it existed. Until that sentence, no one outside the circle knew the president had been taping himself the whole time. The system was supposed to be the ledger. It became the evidence. February 21st, 1972. Beijing. China came through the windows as a flat gray photograph. Concrete hangars. Winter light the color of old newsprint. No crowd, no banners. A line of officials in black coats stood on the tarmac, not moving. Nixon came down the stairs into 7-degree cold. Zhou Enlai was waiting at the bottom. Nixon was already moving for the hand. He had thought about this for 8 months. In 1954, at Geneva, John Foster Dulles had refused to shake Joe's hand, and China had remembered it for 17 years. Nixon was not going to be Dulles. He had decided that before the plane left Andrews. Their hands met. "Over the vastest distance in the world," Joe said. 25 years of no communication. "A long time," Nixon said. Cameras fired from every angle. The anti-communist who had built his career hunting communists, shaking hands with the man who had run the Chinese Revolution since before the Second World War. Neither of them smiled. The back channel that made the handshake possible had run for 8 months through Pakistan, through couriers, through Kissinger, who told the press he had a stomach ailment, and went to bed with a fever in Islamabad and turned up in Beijing 36 hours later. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were not consulted. They were not told until the announcement was made. Nixon did not want their input. He wanted their silence until it was done. The whole defense establishment ran on permanent enemies, Soviet and Chinese both. Nixon was removing one of them, fast, before the institution could mount a defense. The next morning, Mao's study. The chairman was declining. The photograph still showed a man of command, but the man in the chair was diminished. He pushed himself upright before Nixon reached him. He said in Mandarin that he liked rightists. "I've always found," Nixon said, "that those on the right can do what those on the left only talk about." Something crossed Mao's face, the opposite of surprise. They talked for 75 minutes around the thing they were discussing. Near the end, Mao reached across and put his hand on Nixon's arm. The room went quiet. The grip was stronger than it had any right to be. "You have been a long time coming," Mao said. "Too long," Nixon said. "Too long." The body was failing. The grip was not. Mao's hand was cold. Then he released it. On the tarmac afterward, Nixon stood alone in the cold for a minute. He had run the China logic since 1967 and tested it against every counter-argument, and it had held. The world could not be safe until China changed, and China could not change until it was engaged. The opening would fracture the Soviet bloc. It would let him out of Vietnam without the collapse looking total. It would also give China time. Time to industrialize. Time to build the trade and the reserves and the Navy. He had just made it easier for that old man's successors to become powerful in ways his own successors would have to reckon with. He had done it knowing the price. The Soviet threat was immediate. The Chinese calculation was long. He would not live to see what it built. He turned back toward the motorcade. The cold went with him. It began with a column in the Washington Post. 52 inches of verbatim classified intelligence, minute-by-minute notes from a National Security Council meeting on the India-Pakistan War. The kind of notes that do not leave the vault. Here they were, word for word, in Jack Anderson's column. He got them from inside, Nixon said. The name in the file was Radford, a Navy yeoman, 24 years old, assigned to the National Security Council. For 13 months he had carried a small camera. On overseas flights, while Kissinger slept, the yeoman photographed the documents in his briefcase. Papers that were supposed to be burned took a detour first, the back channel to Beijing, the war planning. And the yeoman had not been acting alone. He fed what he photographed up the chain, all the way to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The highest uniformed officer in the American military had been running a spy ring against the president's own national security advisor, against the president. In the Oval Office, Kissinger said the chairman belonged in jail. He was right, and it was useless. Prosecuting the chairman meant a trial. A trial meant discovery. Discovery meant explaining why the Joint Chiefs were spying, which meant exposing the China Initiative, the Vietnam wind-down, every strategic conversation the administration had kept from its own military. We reappoint him, Nixon said. We make it clear we know. We make it clear we're not prosecuting. And we make it clear that if it happens again, we won't be so kind. To find the leaks, he built a unit. The plumbers. The same unit that would, in 6 months, break into a psychiatrist's office looking for dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. The same unit that would, a year later, break into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate. That night, a car pulled into an underground garage in Georgetown. The man who got out did not look at the driver. He rode an elevator to a corridor with no windows. 3 men were already there. They did not stand. The oldest of them had been in Tehran in 1953, had watched the Shah take the throne, and would live to watch him lose it. The president is worried, he said. The oldest man nodded once. The meeting was over. Across town that same night, in a house on N Street, a columnist named Alsop hosted a dinner. Journalists, senators, men from the foundations. They talked about Nixon. Vulgar, one said. Unfit, said another. In the morning, they would write columns calling for his head. None of them mentioned the files in their own basements. June 17th, 1972, 2:45 in the morning. Frank Wills was 24 and made $3 an hour on the graveyard shift at the Watergate, because the job did not require much thinking, and thinking was expensive. His mother was in a home upstate. His sister had a daughter who needed money for school. He found a piece of masking tape folded over a door latch so the lock could not close. Careful work, not rushed. He had worked enough construction jobs to know what care looked like. He peeled it off. He finished his round and came back 40 minutes later. The tape was back on the door. He called the police. 22 minutes later, 5 men came out of the Democratic headquarters with their hands bound. They were professionals. Their files read, Bay of Pigs, Guatemala, the agency. One was still on the CIA payroll. Another still carried the institution's culture like it owned him. Which was the strange part. Nixon was going to win. The polls had solidified in May. The Democrats were about to nominate a man the establishment had already buried. Nixon did not need the Democrats' phone records. He needed to let the clock run out and accept the coronation. So why had 5 CYA men broken into a hotel to steal documents nobody needed? E. Howard Hunt had organized it from a hotel room. 21 years in the agency. Guatemala, the Bay of Pigs, and now the plumbers. Later, under oath, he could not articulate why the burglary had been necessary. The order had come from above. The trail stopped somewhere in a decision tree he had not been looped into. He was getting paid. He was staying connected to the apparatus. The investigation began the moment the arrests happened, and the Washington Post got everything first. The reason had a name. Mark Felt. The number 2 man at the FBI, who had expected to run the Bureau when Hoover died and instead watched Nixon hand it to an outsider. Felt stayed. Felt controlled the Watergate investigation from the inside. He had a young reporter's phone number, and in parking garages after midnight, he shaped what the Post learned and when they learned it. He made sure the narrative pointed one direction the whole way. Nixon knew. Nixon covered up. Nixon was guilty. All of it was true. And all of it kept the other question sealed. Who had sent the burglars and who had needed them found? 3 days after the arrests, Nixon sat at the desk with the machine running and talked for 18.5 minutes about Hunt and the Bay of Pigs and what lives under the scab. The thing no president wanted under oath. Then the tape went dead. 5 separate erasure passes. 1 was not enough. 2 was not enough. 5 passes to unmake what had been said. He held the tape to the light and saw the gap. The thin strip where the oxide had been scraped away. He had erased himself. He put it back in the machine and walked out. The tape kept turning. August 7th, 1974. The Lincoln sitting room. 7 in the evening. Barry Goldwater carried a piece of paper. He came with the Republican leaders of the Senate and the House, 3 men who could count votes and had made the count. We don't have the votes, Goldwater said, and the House would impeach. The Senate needed 67 to convict. What I have, Goldwater said, is maybe 15, and they're not firm. 15 votes. He needs 34. Nixon looked at the paper instead of at Goldwater. I may have to do what has to be done, he said. You're going to have to, Goldwater said. 14 minutes. The 3 men left. Upstairs, Pat was at the mirror, taking off her earrings, the ceremonial pieces first. She did not turn. We're going to be all right, she said. She reached up and touched the old scar on his cheek. Years before, she had cleaned it with a damp cloth while he went over briefing papers, and said nothing then either. That was the marriage, not a comfort. Architecture. Tonight we endure, she said. August 8th, 1974, 9 in the evening. The Oval Office. He read the resignation address to the camera for 15 minutes, alone at the desk. His voice held the whole way through. The next morning, she stopped him at the door. They're going to be kind to you eventually, she said. The ones who hate you now, time will make them kind. I don't want their kindness. I know, she said. That's what makes it complicated. August 9th, 1974. 9:30 in the morning. The East Room. The staff stood shoulder to shoulder under the chandeliers, and then he spoke without notes. He read the page where young Theodore Roosevelt wrote that the light had gone from his life forever, and then he talked about his own father, the streetcar motorman with the lemon ranch, the poorest lemon ranch in California. He said his mother was a saint. His voice changed. Not breaking. Changing. His left hand gripped the podium where the cameras could not see it, until the knuckles went white. Pat stood behind him in a pink dress she had chosen that morning without asking anyone. The color of a woman who would not dress for a funeral while the man was still standing. She did not cry. She did not give the camera the thing it wanted. 10 in the morning. The family crossed the south lawn to the helicopter. At the top of the stairs, before stepping inside, Nixon turned and raised both hands in the V. They had mocked that gesture for years, made it a symbol of something small and desperate and failed. He gave it to them one last time, asking for nothing, defending nothing. Just this. This was the shape of my arm, and this was the movement I was going to make, and I make it now, at the end. The rotors turned. The helicopter lifted over the trees. Below, the lawn was just a lawn now, and the building behind it was just a building. San Clemente, 1974. The study faced the Pacific. 7 in the morning, the habit older than the presidency and unbroken by its end. A yellow legal pad. A cup of black coffee. And beside it now, 2 fingers of gin. He had learned to drink after the presidency, not before. In the presidency, the thinking had to be clean. In Exile, the gin took the edge off the part that wanted to fold, and let the part that still needed to see the board see clearly. The first book came in 1980. The thesis was simple, and everyone in the establishment knew it was true and said it was paranoia. The Soviets were overextended. The system could not sustain itself. The USSR had 10 years, maybe 15. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The men who called him crazy in 1980 called him visionary in 1992, which meant they said nothing at all, because visionary was another word for dead. Reagan called him twice a week, sometimes more than he called Kissinger. The party that had spent 2 decades treating him as the ghost that had to be exorcised now dialed his number after dark to talk about the Soviets, about China, about the moves on the board. None of it was publicized. The most hated man in America was being consulted on war and peace by the men who had replaced him, and none of the calls would appear in the record. In the spring of 1979, he visited the Shah in exile in Cuernavaca, in the house where the deposed king was learning to die. The Shah's hands trembled when he reached for his tea. "It is dangerous to be a friend of the United States," the Shah said in his perfect Oxford English, "and it may pay to be an enemy. I did not fall because I was weak. I fell because your weakness was clear. You would not defend the friend, you would manage the transition. So I fell." Nixon listened. He looked at the old man's trembling hands and recognized the tremor from his own mornings in his own mirror. The men who had done the telling never retired, Nixon thought. The language officers who stayed in country for decades, the men who reported to Langley, they just changed desks. The son took the father's contacts and the father's clearances. They had been in Tehran in 1953. They had been in Saigon in 1963. They had been in Santiago in 1973. They were always there. The Shah thought they were on his side. He never understood that they do not have sides. They have interests. When the two diverge, you are finished. The Shah died in Cairo the next year. No American president came to the funeral, no ambassador. Nixon stood in the Egyptian heat in a dark suit and understood he had spent 20 years explaining this to men who did not want to hear it. American policy was machinery. It ran on its own fuel and answered no one's hand on the wheel. Pat died June 22nd, 1993. In the last week, she stopped speaking in full sentences, but she still reached for his hand when he sat beside the bed. In the months after, he drove to the cemetery in the morning before the light got too bright and stood at the stone without speaking. He did not cry. He did not pray. He did not touch the marble. He stood. Then he took a step back and said the only thing the moment required. "Thank you." He walked back to the car. He never went back. He died at 8 minutes past 9 on the night of April 22nd, 1994. Age 81. In 1975, he had sat before a grand jury under oath. They wanted to know if he had ordered the crimes. He had not ordered all of them. The The plumbers had run on their own logic, and their logic had started with the fact that the Joint Chiefs had been spying on the White House. He told the truth under oath. The grand jury sealed 297 pages. Brent Scowcroft wrote across the envelope in his own hand, "Do not touch. To be opened only by Brent Scowcroft." Scowcroft died in 2020. 36 years after the testimony was sealed, an archivist opened the envelope. Inside were 7 pages, the classification mark still on them, the words intact. 36 years in the dark, and the words were perfect. The men who reported on those pages had never heard of Anna Chennault. They did not know about the call to Dirksen, or the file Johnson buried, or the 4 extra years of war. They thought they had found something new. The apparatus repeats. It waits. Late in exile in Saddle River, the dictating machine sat on the desk. His voice came thin, the rasp of a man who had smoked for 40 years. "What I wouldn't give for just a little more time." He stopped. He set his hand on the machine, the same hand she had found in the dark. The machine was still running, not the dictating machine. The other one. Had it ever been his? Some of it is still sealed. The 18.5 minutes erased from the tape. 5 forensically documented passes. The official explanation was an accident. The forensic analysis said deliberate. The pardon? 31 days after Gerald Ford took office, before any charge was filed, before any indictment, before any trial, unconditional. It covered every offense Nixon had committed, or might have committed, across 5.5 years. Ford's approval fell 22 points in a week. What arrangement, if any, preceded it has never been examined. Haldeman served 18 months for the cover-up. He wrote a book. In it, he said that when Nixon talked about the whole Bay of Pigs thing, he had come to believe the president meant something else. The assassination of President Kennedy. He offered no proof. He had been in the room. And in his last years, E. Howard Hunt left his son a set of tapes. A dying man naming agency men, Bay of Pigs men, and a plan he called the Big Event. His widow said the sons had coached him. The tapes were never formally examined. The sealed testimony was released. The questions remained. The Georgetown room is still there. Different men, same silence. In your Belinda, the 2 stones sit side by side. Her name is first.